if you haven't already, if you'll put your mics on mute, and then we'll take questions at the end of the presentation. You can either type them into the chat or raise your hand. Let us know that you have a question if you want to be on video. Okay, I think we're all set. So let's go ahead and get started. The other folks in. All right, well, welcome to the first of a week of, more or less, a week of events as part of an online artist residency from USC Lancaster's Native American Studies Center. This was a series that we had planned for last year, and of course, with COVID restrictions and so forth, we weren't able to get it coordinated, and so we decided to do these online and to offer you the opportunity to see Catawba artists, traditional Catawba artists, doing their work, creating their artwork, creating their crafts. So it's a series of presentations about Catawba traditional arts and culture with demonstrations. This series is sponsored by and supported by USC Lancaster's Native American Studies Center, Palmetto College, and the South Carolina Arts Commission's Folk Life and Traditional Arts Program, who have been very supportive of our programs over the year. And we just got word this week that they're going to continue to support our efforts. So we're looking forward to a program for the coming year, and just keep an eye out for more information about events at the Native American Studies Center in the coming year, when we hope to be reopened fully to the public by the fall, and so you folks can join us. But I think we're going to continue with these online programs because we've managed to reach a wider audience, and we'll look for some sort of hybrid programming where we can have in-person and online. But this week, from now until next Monday, we'll be featuring Catawba artists. On Wednesday, Keith Little Bear Brown will be joining us at 2 p.m. Friday at 2 p.m. Faye Griner, basket maker. Some of you may have seen her on WBTV last week. She's going to be joining us to talk about basket making. Monty Branham is a Catawba who is a potter, musician, a flute maker, and he'll be talking to us about his various interests and talents, and that'll be on Saturday at 3. And then last but not least, on Monday the 19th at 5 p.m., Becky Garris will be joining us to talk about basket making and other Catawba traditions. But today we're delighted to have the new, or fairly new, archivist for the Catawba Nation, Catawba Tribal Archivist, Ensley Guffey, who'll be talking to us to give us a context for the artistry that we'll be seeing this week. Ensley, just by way of introduction, is the tribal archivist for the Catawba Nation. He holds a master's in history and a master's in library information science. A historian of American popular culture and historical memory studies, he's presented at a variety of national and international academic conferences and pop cultural conventions, and has published peer-reviewed articles on Babylon 5, Breaking Bad, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Farscape, and Marvel's The Avengers. He's also the co-author of Wanna Cook, the complete unofficial companion to Breaking Bad, and A Dream Given Form, the unofficial guide to the universe of Babylon 5. Ensley lives on traditional lands of the Catawba Nation, which remain a part of the modern nation's federally recognized service area in Shelby, North Carolina, with his wife and co-author Kay Dell Kuntz, 3, in his words, imperious cats and 1 goofy dog. We're delighted to have Ensley with us, and please join me in welcoming Ensley to this program, and I'm going to turn things over to you now. Go ahead, Ensley. Oh, I think you're still on mute. There you are.
Tanake. Tanake, Niat Ensley Guffey, Archivist Catawba Hare. Hi, my name's Ensley Guffey, and I, as Stephen said, am the tribal archivist for the Catawba Indian Nation. I should begin with a bit of a caveat. I myself am not Catawba, and while I am a trained historian and archivist, I certainly do not speak for all Catawba or all Native Americans by any stretch of the imagination. I'd like to keep things a little bit informal, so I have a prepared speech and presentation to give with some PowerPoints. I'm also kind of I have a tendency to kind of divert from my script from time to time. So if you'll just bear with me, I'm going to share my screen at this point, and I'll keep the chat open so that I should be able to see. Okay, where is the chat? There it is. Put that on this screen over here so I'll be able to see if something goes wrong and suddenly I can't be heard or seen. I'm also going to turn off my video. I find it kind of distracting to see myself as I'm doing these things. So, and we'll just get started. I hope to make this as painless as possible for all of us. So, top history, this will be just a very brief overview. There is a lot I'm going to be leaving out or just basically touching on. It would be quite easy to do a full semester or more course in Catawba history, but we're not here to do that today. Now, the Catawba Indian Nation is the only federally recognized tribe in South Carolina and one of only two in North Carolina, the other being the Cherokee. The Catawba are not the only tribe in South Carolina, but the only one that has federal recognition, and we'll get into why that's important, what that means just a little bit later. This week, you're going to have the opportunity to learn a great deal about the Catawba people through traditional arts and technologies of pottery, basket making, drumming, flute playing, and flute making, as told and demonstrated by Catawbas who continue to practice them, often in the exact same manner that their ancestors would have more than 6,000 years ago. And so what I'm trying to do today is just to give you an overview of the history and let you know, kind of give you a sense where these practices fit in with the Catawba culture as a whole and the history as a whole. So before Europeans came to North America, the Catawba people, like most Native American peoples, had no written language. North American natives did not develop written scripts, unlike the natives of Meso and South America, the Mayans, Olmecs, and so on. So much of what we know about the Catawba in what's called the pre-Columbian era, we've learned through archaeology. And the Catawba call themselves Yeiswahare, the people of the river, because they've lived along what is today called the Catawba River for at least 6,000 and possibly as long as 10,000 years. In part, we've been able to learn about the ancient people who became the Catawba because they have always been potters. And pottery, fired clay, is one of the most durable human-made substances known. It's, for instance, why we know so much about the Sumerians. Because the cuneiform tablets, which they basically kept their archives and accounts books on, were etched in clay, which was then fired, and it holds together very, very well over thousands of years. And often when fired clay is broken, the pieces are lying around and you can piece together what was there. And with the Catawba and what I'll be calling the Carolina Piedmont peoples, you do have quite a bit of potsherds and whole bits of pottery that have survived for thousands of years. Now, pottery has played a central role in Catawba culture throughout history, including today when contemporary artists continue to create pieces using the exact same techniques that their distant ancestors did. Not all the time, there have been some improvements in pottery technology that the Catawba potters have thoroughly taken advantage of. But to a great extent, many of the potters working today in 2021 are still making pots the exact same way that the Carolina natives and the Piedmont region would have been making 6,000 years ago, which is absolutely incredible and totally fascinating. The traditional Catawba lands, as you can see on this map from the Smithsonian Institution of '66, contained all of the Piedmont regions of North and South Carolina and up into Southern Virginia. The Catawba spoke what is today referred to as Eastern Siouan. And if the word Siouan sounds familiar to you, that may be because linguists believe that about 1,000 years ago, a group of Siouan-speaking Piedmont, Carolina natives migrated west into Ohio and the Great Plains, and there established the tribes that we know today as the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, the Sioux tribes, made famous in American pop culture and history by warriors like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and of course the destruction of the 7th Cavalry under George Custer. But their ancestors came most likely from the Catawba lands and the Piedmont cultures of the Carolinas. Just as a side note of history there. See, there's one of the digressions I will make throughout this presentation. So the Catawba are in, despite being based in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Southern Virginia, travelers and traders of the Catawba went much farther afield, and we have found evidences of Catawba trade goods and pots as far north as New England and then down into southern Florida. So Catawbas were traveling and their goods were being traded all up and down the eastern seaboard of what's now the United States. Now, the Catawba were not a nomadic people. They, like all native peoples, went through various migrations in prehistory and during historical times, even like the Sioux. But for the most part, the Catawba lived in permanent and independent towns called Wimutu. Each town considered itself politically independent from the rest, and they had their own leaders, but all of the towns would come together in order to wage war or conduct diplomacy with other tribes and, eventually with the European settlers. This is a famous deerskin map given by a Catawba chief to the governor of the Carolinas, that would be the British royal governor of the Carolinas at the time, the British colonies, in 1721. This is a copy made later from the original deerskin. And what this shows are 13 Catawba towns. They were all, like I said, they all considered themselves independent political entities. And the connections between those towns and between two different British settlements. You can see Charleston down in the lower left and Virginia in the lower right. So obviously the map not quite to scale, but these were the major towns at that period. And by 1721, there were unfortunately fewer than when the Europeans first came through. But this gives you a kind of idea of the network of the Catawba civilization, these connected towns that traded with each other, that traded with the European colonists, that traded with other tribes and warred with other tribes, certainly. And occasionally later on, as we'll see, got into various wars with the European colonists. So the Catawba were great travelers and traders, but they did have very permanent fixtures. They were town-dwelling people. The first contact between Europeans and the Catawba came in 1540, when the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto passed through the Catawba Watery River Valley. De Soto described large and powerful native populations in the region, as did his fellow countryman Juan Pardo, whose expedition came through the region some 20 years later. Now, this was well before any permanent colonies were established. Of course, both De Soto and Pardo were looking for gold in traditional conquistador trinity of God, guns, and glory. And there were some interesting conflicts. I'll be it nothing huge, when the conquistadors, particularly Pardo, were convinced that the Catawba were hiding these vast fields of gold from them, which of course the Catawba were not. But neither of these, DeSoto's just kind of passed lightly through the edge of Catawba territory. Pardo went much deeper into Catawba territory, but neither of them stayed. Neither founded a permanent colony. That came a little later. As the number of European traders and colonists continued to grow, however, the towns of the Piedmont people, of the Piedmont culture, were repeatedly rocked by epidemic diseases. Smallpox is the most famous example, wars with other tribes, and with white colonists. Now, as the population shrank due to these causes, what happened was the people of the various towns began to coalesce into a smaller and smaller number of towns. So some towns would find themselves nearly wiped out by, war or disease, and they would decide that, okay, we don't really have enough people to keep our town a going concern, so we're going to move to another town. Everyone in this area and we're speaking various dialects of this Eastern Siouan language. Catawba was called the court language by a later explorer, and linguists think that's where modern Catawba developed. And of course, just because they didn't have a written language didn't mean that the Catawba did not possess a sophisticated spoken language. So people from these towns that had been devastated would join in with people from other towns who spoke, the same kind of language and had the same kind of traditions, built the same kind of houses. And so these smaller towns begin to consolidate into the larger towns. And over time, you see fewer and fewer towns and fewer independent political entities. So after the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717, which was between the British colonists and the Yamasee tribes of southeastern South Carolina, this was a big time of town consolidation, when a lot of the Piedmont towns consolidated with a tribe known as the Esau. Now, when I'm giving you these tribe names, keep in mind that these are kind of bastardizations of what the native words were. Our records of this come down from various European and colonial sources. So, Esau was how it was written down, E-S-A-W. But we know that, this was also at various points, these people were also referred to as the Nassau, the Iswa, which if you'll remember, the Catawba call themselves the Iswa Hare, the people of the river, and also known as Catawba. But this amalgamation after the Yamasee War, by 1750s, you really had the emergence of the Catawba Nation. And this is the nation that we consider today being, the direct continuous line all the way back to this time period. So 1750s, this kind of consolidation, you have the Catawba Nation. Now, this decision, the Catawbas had fought during the Yamasee War alongside the British. And the Catawba leaders had always been very, very good about picking the right side in various conflicts. For instance, fighting with the British, both in the Yamasee War and later in the French and Indian War of 1754 to 1763. And a lot of this was a recognition that they needed to maintain excellent relations with the right set of colonists in order to be able to survive, to keep at least some of their traditional lands, and to be sure that they didn't find themselves on the wrong end of a colonial war, knowing very well what happened to natives that found themselves on the wrong end of that particular blade. And this seemed to pay off pretty big after the French and Indian War, under the skillful leadership of Nopcahey, who the British called King Hagler, but his name was Nopcahey. And then after Nopcahey was killed by a Shawnee raiding party, Chief Jacob Ayres, the governor of South Carolina, in the name of King George III, made a treaty with the Catawba, setting aside 144,000 acres for the Catawba's sole use, barring European colonists from settling in that land. Now, 144,000 acres is not a lot of land when you consider that the Catawba's once the Catawba's traditional territory covers parts of what are now 3 states. But this was kind of a victory, because if they could maintain this land, if settlers were prevented from encroaching on it, this gave them a kind of legal claim to the land in the eyes of the British. And when I talk about legal here, for a lot of times, the Catawba were also very savvy in realizing that in order for any kind of claims to their traditional lands to be recognized, they had to get them recognized in the eyes of first, the British, and then, of course, the American governments, which meant dealing with property and land laws from British and American legal perspectives. This 144,000 acre reservation, certified by the Treaty of Augusta, protected the Catawba from the emerging British policy of quote unquote Indian removal. This, of course, is when native tribes were often forcibly removed from their traditional lands and quote unquote resettled somewhere with promises that that the new land would be theirs forever and ever, amen. And we all know how that tended to turn out, and often put on land that either the colonial and later American governments believed would never get settled, and therefore they had no interest in, or that was really cruddy land to begin with that they didn't figure any settlers would want. However, that never really wound up being the case. And of course, when the United States came into being, they picked up that policy of Indian removal and ran with it and exacerbated it. One of the more famous brutal elements of that would be Andrew Jackson's famous removal orders, resulting in the Trail of Tears. So this is a map showing the 144,000 acre reservation established by the Treaty of Augusta. You will notice that that square of reservation land is, that border has a little notch in the border of North and South Carolina. When the colony of Carolina was divided into the states of North and South Carolina, the existence of that reservation land caused that little divot to be made in the state lines, because North Carolina apparently didn't want to nobody wanted to deal with trying to split that land, or North Carolina didn't particularly want to have to deal with the Catawbas and the Cherokee. So that reservation, based on the 1763 treaty, is why Northern Carolina to this day have that weird little perfect right angle divot notched out of the states. That's where it came from. So keep in mind, you kind of on this map, the scale of that. That's 144,000 acres, and it's again, compared to where the Catawba used to roam, not that much space, but still a chunk enough to actually change the political geography of a couple states. Now, as you can probably imagine, the terms of the Treaty of 1763 were only briefly honored. And in just a few years, European settlers again began moving into Catawba lands. Now, in part, the Catawba were the only tribe to fight on the side of the Patriots during the American War for Independence from the very beginning. Others joined in later, but from the get-go, the Catawba sided with the Patriots. And in part, they did so in the hope that the new republic that would be founded would recognize and uphold this reservation land, this 144,000 acres of reservation. It is likely that someone somewhere along the way, in trying to get Catawba support, promised this. The Catawba were very well known as fierce and canny warriors, so the Patriots really wanted to have them on their side. And during the war, the Catawba gave such good service, they appear in General George Washington's diaries in very complimentary terms about their bravery and capabilities on the battlefield. Yet, after the foundation of the United States, the white settlers continued to encroach on Catawba lands, and despite the praise that Washington heaped on them during the war, 2 personal visits to President Washington failed to move the Catawba's old commander-in-chief to act on the Catawba's behalf. The Revolutionary War was obviously the first war where the Catawba fought for what would be the United States, and the Catawba have fought in pretty much every conflict the United States has been in since. The Catawba have a very long tradition of military service in the forces of the United States. But in any event, by 1796, things had gotten so bad that in order to try and hold on to just, at least some of their traditional lands, the remaining 3 towns, so we've gone from 1721 with a map of 13 towns, which wasn't all inclusive, but we're down to 3 towns now. They got together and created and registered a land title for their territory. And again, this was an attempt to get their ownership, their possession of some of their traditional lands recognized by the American legal system. So they came up with this by the laws of South Carolina and the United States, this land title. And interestingly, from a historian's perspective, it's pretty common for the Catawba actually, the title was held in the name of the people who had the actual ownership of the land according to law, was Sally New River and other women of the Catawba Nation. I'm sure I don't have to tell any of you that having a woman, much less a group of women, having clear title to land in the late 18th century in either Britain or the United States was terribly unusual. But in terms of the Catawba, it's not unusual at all. Because in the Catawba towns, to time immemorial, it was the women who had always controlled the home and associated land in each town. When it was time to build a house, a woman got married, the woman was in charge of building the house. Now the men would help with the heavy lifting, but it was the woman who designed and oversaw the building of the house, who planted the gardens, who tended the gardens, and it was also the women who made pottery traditionally. Now that, as we'll get into a little bit later, pottery was a all hands on deck family affair from beginning to end, but it was generally the women who were actually crafting the materials, whether it be a pot or a plate or a pipe. It was usually the women who were building it and making it. So the Catawba's land title was just kind of naturally, from their perspective, given into Sally New River, who was the daughter of a Catawba chief, and the other women of the tribe. Now, having a land title also gave the Catawba, that's cool, Haley. That's really cool. So Brooke Bauer, actually, here's another tangent. Dr. Brooke Bauer, her thesis, which she's working on now turning into a published book, is all about Sally New River and Catawba women. I've been fortunate enough to read her thesis, and it is brilliant. So I hope that soon that'll be out there and everybody can get a chance to read it because it's fascinating history. So another big thing about having land title was that the Catawba could then lease land to people. So, and of course, under law, you can't lease land unless you own it. So again, it was another method of trying to really underline in American law that this is our land. And it was theoretically a way that the Catawba could collect rents and get some income because it's just like renting anything else. You get paid, whether in money or in crops or in kind. Now, as I'm sure you're all shocked to find out, neither the land title or the ability to lease the land stopped white settlers from pretty much just rolling in and taking it. Oftentimes the Catawba were not given much of a choice whether or not to lease the land. And it turned out whether they paid their rent or no, it was really, really hard to get the white people off the land once they had settled in. And very rarely would any court do what they should have done and help evict squatters, as it were. So by 1840, the Catawba population had dwindled so much that it was really commonly believed that they'd soon just die out. In fact, it is the reason the Catawba were not swept up on the Trail of Tears. The government of South Carolina at the time decided that they weren't going to bother to spend the money it would cost to ship them out to Oklahoma because they were going to die out anyway. So that's why the Catawba at the time, very, very few. I think about 1849, the population was listed at something like 49 adults. It was just crazy. But that's why the Catawba remained when so many other people were, put on that horrible march because the government of South Carolina didn't think it was worth the expense because, hey, they were going to die out anyway. Now, in 1840, the chief of that time, General James Kegg, as a side note, during the Revolutionary War, the Catawba had always, after the British started calling their chiefs kings, the Catawba had kind of adopted that title for their chiefs because, okay, that was kind of speaking the language of the British. Well, when the American Republic came along, of course, kings were bad. So instead of using royal titles, the Catawba switched to military rank titles for their leaders. General, of course, being the rank title given to a chief. So you see the shift from King so and so to General so and so or Colonel so and so, starting around the American Revolution, a little bit after. So James Kegg sought, the population had declined so much that he thought the solution was, okay, let's figure. Sorry about that. I think my audio went out for just a second. So anyway, James Kegg, the population of the Catawba had declined so much that he decided that the best thing was to do what the Catawba people had done in the past and consolidate. The Catawba in South Carolina were so small, they just thought it was time, to figure out a way to pick up and consolidate. Their idea was to go to North Carolina with the Cherokee, where there were a few Catawba already living who had migrated through marriage and so on throughout the decades. So he negotiated what's called the Treaty of Nation Ford with the government of South Carolina. And the idea was the Catawba would relinquish all claims to 144,000 acres granted to them in 1763 in return for cash payments and help with resettling the remaining Catawba into North Carolina. Now, the only problem with the Treaty of Nation Ford was that it was illegal. According to the Constitution of the United States, only the federal government can make treaties with tribes. And those treaties, like all treaties made by the federal government, then have to be ratified by Congress. A state or a town or a municipality does not have the authority to make treaties with tribes, with native people. Traditionally, that's because the federal government's relationship with tribes is seen as a nation to nation, and only the federal government has the authority to make treaty with other nations. Now, with native nations, that's generally they are seen as what were they called dependent nations for a while. As we get into talking a bit more about modern Indian law, you'll hear me start to use the word Indian, and this is very specific. While Indian, of course, is not the term that is most often applied to Native Americans, nor should it be. In American law, anything you have to see dealing with the tribes they're always referred to as Indians. So if you were in a court of law or you're talking about something like, say, the Indian Child Welfare Act, you must use the word Indian because that is the word in law. That is the legal term for Native North Americans. So that's why you have the Bureau of Indian Affairs to this day. So when I'm talking about law, you're going to hear me talk about, say, the word Indian, where most of the time I'm either using Catawba or Native Americans and speaking more generally. And that is why. So only the federal government has the authority to make Indian treaties, period. That was the case in 1840. It is the case today. Now, so the Treaty of Nation Ford, completely illegal, unconstitutional. And in any event, South Carolina didn't fulfill their part of it at all. But despite this, on both the state and federal levels, the Treaty of Nation Ford was treated as legitimate for the next 150 years. And obviously it was treated that way because it was awfully convenient, because it pretty much, gave that 144,000 acres in that little corner of North and South Carolina, that was open for anything. Now, it ended up that the Cherokee did not particularly want the Catawba moving to settle with them. The Catawba lacked the resources to pick up and move. So for several years, they were quite literally homeless on their traditional lands until South Carolina set apart what today is known as the Old Reservation for the Catawba. And this is straight from Google Maps. And the bit in red is the Old Reservation. So you went from the Old Reservation is 630 acres. The Catawba, before the coming of the Europeans, inhabited a territory that was estimated to cover 50,000 square miles. Now, here in the 1840s, the Catawba were confined to 1 square mile of land. Out of roaming from pretty much all of South Carolina, the Piedmont of North Carolina into Southern Virginia, 1 square mile of land alongside the Catawba River in a part of York County that was pretty undeveloped and for sure very, very rural. I think the first 3 houses were wired for electricity on the reservation in 1940. So that gives you some idea of the conditions in that part of York County and on the reservation until that time. So the Catawba were now confined to just 1 square mile of land. But it was from this 1 square mile of land, the Old Reservation, where the Catawba would begin their long fight to correct the injustice of the illegal Treaty of Nation Ford. The reservation, located near Rock Hill, it was a rural, flood-prone, and contained none of the Catawba's traditional clay sites, where for thousands of years they dug clay for the pottery. So even up until today, the Catawba have to ask permission of the people who currently own their traditional land to go and dig clay from the traditional clay sites to make pottery, which is not great, to say the least. Now, racism at every level of American life ensured that the Catawba remained largely isolated and poor throughout the 19th and well into the 20th centuries. Now, ironically, this isolation actually helped the Catawba to maintain a strong cultural identity and an awareness of themselves as a people and a nation. Now, making pottery, traditional dancing, drumming, flute playing, basket weaving, these were all vital elements in keeping the Catawba culture alive. And they also became an economic lifeline for many families. Not to mention that, while a lot of times today we tend to think of pottery making, basket weaving, all these things as art, these were very real practical technologies, always had been for the Catawba. When the Catawba, many of them were very poor. I mean, hard scrabble poverty. But when you can make plates and bowls and cooking utensils and baskets, this allows you to get through some really, really hard times. But also, all of this was considered art, and Catawba pottery. It's difficult to overstate the importance of pottery to the Catawba. Catawba pottery is the oldest continuous native pottery tradition in North America, period. It predates the Pueblo tradition. And besides the Pueblo, it is the only other pottery making tradition to survive continuously in North America. Catawba pottery was valued by other tribes and European colonists alike, both for practical use and because of the sheer beauty of the pieces they were able to make. Now, the Catawba made pieces, and many still do today, make in the traditional manner, was with hands, without wheels, without kilns, and their pottery allowed them not only to trade for things they needed with other tribes, but also to participate early on and continuously in a kind of unfamiliar foreign monetary economy when the Europeans came in. And it also enabled many Catawba families, particularly in these tough times in the late 19th through well into the late 20th century, to literally making and selling pottery was what a lot of times was the difference between survival and starvation, or being able to put clothes on the backs of your kids. It really was a lifeline. And today, of course, the Catawba pottery is recognized internationally. It is one of the great pottery traditions of the world. And pottery making was a family activity. Everybody in the family helped out. Men would help dig and beat and process the clay as with kids. The women and children made the coils. The women built the coils into vessels, and everybody, young and old, multi-generations, would sit and scrape and rub the clay to form the pot, while the mother and father or grandmother would fire the pots and the vessels in open fires, just like literally going in the backyard building a fire. That's how you fired the clay. Again, no kilns. In a very real way, pottery directly connected Catawba generations across the centuries, even across the millennia, because this is the way that they'd always made pottery. And it really helped the nation to preserve their culture and the knowledge of themselves as a people, despite all the trials they faced throughout the history. These are photos of the Brown family digging and processing clay on the Old Reservation in 1908. And like I said, you can see this was a whole family activity. You'll see Rachel Brown there sitting with the basket, which more than likely she wove by hand. They're digging the raw clay, and then they beat the clay. You can just see a clay beater in the lower center laying on that square of what's probably concrete, basically a big wooden stick with a heavy end that you would wet and beat the clay to help beat out the impurities and get it to the form where you could work it, and then you process it by hand to work out and make it even more workable and any remaining impurities from the beating. We have a ton of these materials that were used in the making of clay in the archives. Some of the clay beaters are really kind of interesting. I have one that is a hand whittled shaft of wood topped with some sort of gear from I don't know what kind of machine that was then covered in hide. And the hide has partially disintegrated away from use, but it looks like when I first found it, I thought it was some sort of mace, like a medieval weapon or something. But it was a clay beater because you had that big heavy piece of metal on the end to help bring more force down to beat the clay. But the traditional kind of tools, um, it's a great example of how they kind of morphed as things went along. Because someone had this extra gear laying around that they went, hey, that'd be perfect to put a little extra weight and extra heft to the clay beater, and rigged it up. So in 1941, the Catawba became a federally recognized tribe. And I talked about this early in the presentation. And what this means is that the US government's dealings with the Catawba were legally placed on a nation-to-nation basis. So basically, this was the government of the United States, one nation, saying, okay, Catawba Nation, we recognize you as another nation, and that you are therefore, you deal with us directly. This allowed the Catawba to receive various types of government services and gave the nation access to various federal programs and funding. This was a really, really good thing for the Catawba. This gave them the resources they really needed to help start lifting the Catawba people out of this kind of isolation and desperate poverty that so many were living in for so long. And in 1953, however, the US Congress passed a resolution to terminate the tribal status of tribes the government determined were ready to fully, quote unquote, assimilate into American society. Now, termination meant that tribal reservations and federal land trusts would be broken up and all that property made into private property rather than being held by a tribe or in trust for a tribe. This also would cut off sources of federal funding, federal grants, federal assistance. And this really was a mid-20th century land grab attempt by the United States and by Congress under a kind of rubric of trying to save money. The excuse was, well, these people are, they're ready to assimilate. They're right there. They're pretty much American citizens anyway. So really, they don't really need special treatment. We'll just, integrate them right into our society and everything will be fine. This is 1950s, of course. Systemic and just blatant racism was, in full flower, particularly in the South. And yeah, fundamentally, this was a land grab, and nobody really cared what happened to the Catawba. And the way they went about it was they chose a very specific few people to vote on whether or not the Catawba wanted to terminate their status as a federally recognized tribe. It was not put before the entire Catawba Nation to vote on. They literally made some really shady promises to a few people and only invited those people to vote on whether or not termination should happen. They never revealed the full plans, which they claimed that all the land would revert directly into Catawba ownership, but that was never going to happen. Some of it did, but not all of it. And so in 1961, termination took into effect. It is interesting to note that out of all the federally recognized tribes on the East Coast of the United States, only the Catawba were chosen for termination. It is likely because the Catawba were pretty small, and there was this really hinky kind of deal. No one's sure exactly why the Catawba were picked out, probably because of their size and also because it was determined there weren't going to be, they didn't have enough political clout one way or another to kick up much of a fuss. So 1961, the Catawba Nation lost its federal recognition, and adding tragedy to insult, that same year, the last fluent native speaker of Catawba, Chief Samuel Taylor Blue, died. So without federal recognition and support, preserving the cultural identity and their sense of themselves as a people, as a nation, as a tribe became much, much more difficult. During this period from 61, 62, all the way to 1993, it's really only the efforts of individual Catawbas that kept the language, heritage, arts, and traditional culture from disappearing forever. Recordings and records, family histories, and genealogies were lovingly kept and carefully stored or rescued from dank basements or unprotected garage shelves to be saved for another day. The Catawba organized and invested their own time and money into teaching the children their history and the culture. Master potters continued to teach their art to younger generations. The same goes with flute making and playing, and drum making and playing, basket weaving. Basket weaving was almost lost during this time period. And this helped ensure that kind of material, physical link with the Catawba past, present, and future. The next 30 years were a really, really rough time for the Catawba, and it was very, very possible that they might just kind of disintegrate. But during the 1960s, the 1960s civil rights movement wound up being a spark for modern Native rights movements. A lot of Native Americans joined in to take part in the various marches and activities of the civil rights movements for African Americans, and used the lessons they learned there to begin to form their own rights organizations. And you know, this also, you find Native Americans working in the various labor and rights movements for migratory workers and seasonal workers. And in the late 60s and early 70s, you really have the rise of the modern Native rights movement. In the 1970s, you had, you know, the American Indian movement. They were big, you know, the occupation of Little Bighorn, the occupation of Alcatraz. But Native Americans during the late 60s and 70s really began to work hard and lead their own civil rights movement that we don't hear too much about. But this also took place on legal battlefields as well. And it's in the 70s and into the 80s when you start to see things like the Indian Child Welfare Act and other Native American acts get passed. So in the 1970s, the Catawbas reorganized once again and really began the long legal battle to regain federal recognition. Because remember, Treaty of Nations 4 that took, you know, away the 144,000 acres, totally illegal, totally, you know, unconstitutional, although accepted as legitimate. So there's 20 years of lawsuits here. The Catawba first, there are two ways where you can regain federal recognition. One is via a process of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, one is by an act of Congress. So naturally, as anyone would, Catawba tried the Bureau of Indian Affairs first because that seemed a lot easier than an act of Congress. Well, absolutely no luck there. So they had to regroup and try and go for an act of Congress. Now, surprise, surprise, there weren't too many representatives or senators from the great state of South Carolina really interested in helping out with this. So the Catawba, based on the illegality of the Treaty of Nations Ford in 1840, started suing what became the Catawba land claim, because that treaty of 1763 had never been abrogated legally. So therefore, the Catawba claim, they still had rights to 144,000 acres of land right in that little right angle divot between North and South Carolina. Well, it got really nowhere in the state and federal court systems, but working with an organization out west, a Native American legal defense fund and organization, what the Catawba wound up doing was filing suit against every landholder in York County, South Carolina. Now, they weren't trying to get anybody, they weren't trying to take these people's lands. But what happens when the land you own is involved in some sort of suit is that you have a lien on your property, and you cannot sell your house if it has a lien on it. You can't. That's just it's illegal. So all of a sudden, all the residents of York County started contacting their state representatives and their congressional representatives and their senatorial representatives, and all of a sudden there was a much more support for a settlement of the Catawba lands question. So in 1993, the Catawba lands claims were settled. The Treaty of Nations Ford was recognized as illegal. The Old Reservation was restored, and some financial restitution was made. The government, the Catawba, regained their recognition as a federal recognition as a tribal nation. And they awarded the Catawba Indian Nation a service area that includes all of South Carolina and 5 North Carolina counties, which is at least some recognition of the territory that the Catawba historically and traditionally lived in. And what that service area means is that entire area, all of South Carolina, those 5 North Carolina counties, any native living in those areas, be they Catawba or otherwise, falls under the Catawba's purview and can claim, assistance. The Catawba currently have a clinic that is one of the only native clinics in the Southeast. And any Native American who needs medical care of some type can come to that clinic and receive health care for free. And indeed, they sadly do have people who travel from Florida. There's even been some folks coming from Arkansas and points further west because they can't afford to get medical care elsewhere. But the Catawba provide that. So that's their service area. With access once again to federal grants, the Catawba Nation began to provide more and more support to its people. Housing, healthcare, education, social services of all kinds. The modern nation continues to grow. And the 21st century has brought about what Chief Bill Harris, who's the current chief of the Catawba, likes to call the Catawba Renaissance. Efforts to revitalize the Catawba language have rapidly expanded, and language curricula has been created and is in place for elementary and middle schools. The Catawba Cultural Preservation Project, the unit of the Catawba Indian Nation that I work for, has continued to promote and protect the traditional arts and technologies. And the nation has expanded into a variety of business and economic areas, which reduces the nation's dependence on federal support and ensures their ability to serve the Catawba people and to preserve the culture no matter what the future may bring. Ultimately, the Catawba want to try and position themselves where, if worse came to worse, and for some reason the federal government once again effectively terminated their recognition, they would still be able to go forward as a people and to be able to provide the services and to continue Catawba history well into the future. And that's kind of the basic overview of Catawba history. And now I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. And thank you for listening to me natter on.
Thank you, Ensley. That was very, very informative. Yeah, I've been trying to learn as much about Catawba history over the past I don't know, 15 years, and there were some things in there that I wasn't aware of. And I'm personally I'm fascinated by the collection of clay beaters that are in the archive. I didn't realize that. So while we're waiting, you know, if folks have questions, they can type them into the chat or pop in. I can't remember if we can raise hands on Zoom, but I had a quick question for you about those the beaters. The one you said that looked like it had a gearhead on it. Did you have a date on that?
It is early 20th century is about the best I can do.
Okay.
Probably 1910s, 1920s.
Okay, because I was wondering if it was something that might have come from one of the textile mills, and I was wondering if you could say much about the Catawbas working in the local textile mills in York County and in the area.
Yeah, the you know, the Catawbas were definitely part of the millwork back when textiles were so huge in this part of the South and in South Carolina, and were you know, definitely a part of all of the various labor movements and troubles and trials and tribulations and you know, health conditions that came out of the mills. You know, what they call it, gray lung was what you called it in the mills as compared to black lung. But yeah, the Catawba were part of the millwork force for many years.
Okay. Let's see. We have Leo Schaefer asking, where can I find this recording? I'm not sure which recording. Leo, do you want to jump in and clarify that? Let's see. Is Leo still with us? Well, if not, you might be asking about this recording of this particular session. And I believe this recording eventually will go on to our Native American Studies Center YouTube page. If you go onto YouTube and you type in Native American Studies Center, it brings up our videos. Oh, wait, here's Leo. Let's see. We'll come back around to him. Let's see.
So yes, Haley, the service area does consist of those counties in North Carolina, the 144,000 acres. I live in Cleveland County, North Carolina, and that is part of the service area. It's one of the 5 counties. It's also one of the reasons that the Catawba were able to get that 16 acres set aside in Kings Mountain for the new resort and casino, because that is part not only of their traditional lands, but also of the service area, and has been since they gained their federal recognition. Let's see, what else we got? Yeah, I think I answered the question there. Yvette, probably, at least at some point during their history, they did probably accept runaway slaves. During the 1860s, there were 1 or 2 Catawbas who actually owned slaves. So the Catawba and it's important to remember that the colonials, starting with the British, very much tried to put an end towards the cooperation between native peoples and escaped slaves very early on in the very harshest terms possible. That's why eventually you pretty much only had the Seminole, who were still really the place you could escape to. It was just too dangerous after a while, and really there was a movement in the late 18th and early to mid 19th centuries where, you know, Native Americans were really trying to assimilate and were being forced to assimilate, particularly on the East Coast. So yeah, I wish I could have kind of a different answer for that, but no, by the late 18th century, probably a runaway slave would not have thought of the Catawba lands as a safe place to run to, although there very well could have been, you know, people who would help out, probably were, but I don't have any historical data on that. Augusta Treaty 1763. What is the source of my slide? Let me see which slide that is. Oh, okay. Yeah, this is kind of funny. This is based on this. I've used this one because it was good and sharp and clear, but it's actually based upon it comes from a book about the youth of Andrew Jackson, of All God Awful People. but it is also based on, as you can see in the little map of earlier map things, and that is the area of the Catawba Reservation. So it's accurate. I just used that particular image because that was a good, sharp, clear image I could use for a PowerPoint. But yes, it's based upon a book about the youth of Andrew Jackson. So, which the irony I sort of enjoyed there, but whatever. Let's see.
We can answer Leo that yes, this is being recorded and should be on the Native American Studies YouTube page in the near future. So, and then you have a question about Bamberg, South Carolina.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Jessica Collins. I'm currently in Bamberg County, but I've been doing a little bit of digging and trying to understand the Native Americans in my area. And I wanted to know, did you have anything about the healing springs? And I know a lot of things were found in Allendale County that are thousands of years old. They want to date the healing spring back to maybe 20,000 years from the book that I was reading.
I don't know if maybe you had contacted us at the archives, but someone had contacted me a while back about Bamberg and that area of South Carolina. And as I was sharing with Stephen earlier today, right now the archives are kind of in a state of flux. We just got a new content management system. We moved everything out, put new shelves in, moved everything back in. And so I'm really at the point now of just getting down to the nitty-gritty of arranging and describing and cataloging the archives materials. So that I have like a running list of questions people have asked me. I have not run across or found anything about Bamberg in particularly. I'm aware of the natives in that area, but how they connect with Catawba and Catawba history, I haven't been able to find any direct research on. I will say that if the date of 20,000 years ago is correct, that would make it one of the very earliest sites. I think there's a couple of sites in Virginia that have pushed back. You know, we used to think that the earliest native settlements in North America dated to about 13,000 years ago, roughly, but we found some sites that have pushed that date further back. We really don't know quite as much as we think about how people migrated to North America. You know, it used to be the land bridge theory out of, you know, what's the Bering Strait now, and then they filtered down. We're not sure anymore if that was the only route, and particularly when they came. So it really is, we're learning more and more. It's not a dead history at all because there's still so much we don't know. But if and when I run across any more information, oh yeah, it was a vet. Okay. Right. Okay. So if Bamberg is definitely on my radar, and when I'm going through researching things and turning things up, I have not found anything specific yet, but I will certainly let y'all know when and if I do.
Okay, thank you. Because in a lot of our areas around here, we are connected to Edisto River.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been trying to figure out what Native Americans go with what areas around the and I've even traveled to the different accesses. So I've been trying to hit every land bridging there to try to, you know, see what's out there, the culture or whatever.
Yeah, it can be very difficult to really definitively say, okay, this site was just this tribe or this people or that people, because, you know, there really was a lot of travel and trade up and down the entire eastern seaboard between all of the various native peoples. You know, in fact, if you look at the routes for a lot of our major highways and interstates, you trace them back farther enough, and they're trade paths that various tribes walked. So it's, you know, a lot of times I get people wanting to say, oh, you know, can you tell me if this arrowhead is Catawba? And I have to go, no, because, you know, because of that trade, you know, everybody was often using, you know, when it comes to like projectile points, you pretty much had the same technology everywhere. So just taking something, you know, unless you see it in situ with other artifacts and other levels, it's very hard to say, okay, this was a Catawba town, and particularly with the widespread trade in Catawba pottery, like I said, we found it as far up as New England, as far south as southern Florida. So, but if I run across anything about Bamberg and that county, I will certainly let you guys know and let Yvette know. I have her email and now Jessica's. So.
And Jessica, I would just add in terms of contemporary Native communities, Bamberg, if I'm remembering my map right, you're not terribly far from the current Beaver Creek Indians, the NT, maybe even not too far from the Wassamasaw. There are a couple of state recognized tribes in your area, and some of them have community centers and small archives and
Yes.
some history that might be of assistance to you. If you go to the Commission for Minority Affairs site, you can find contact for those tribes.
I sure will try that. Actually, we are about 14 miles. Blackville is the healing spring, and that was also for I think you said what, Black Creek?
Beaver Creek.
Beaver Creek, excuse me. For the Beaver Creek Indians, I think that they would be linked to the healing spring. And that is in Blackville and Bamberg. It's approximately 14 miles. So I've been doing digging there. They found arrowheads in Allendale, South Carolina, dating back 18,000 years. So this webinar, I will be joining. This was my first one. I love it.
Great. And I'm reminded that the Edistes Natchez Coosa group is down that way as well. And when, Ensley talks about, movement and migration, I think that group, particularly the Edisto Natchez Coosa group, their history goes back to other areas before coming into South Carolina. Yeah. So, there's a lot of shifting and moving going on throughout history, but particularly in the 16, 17, 1800s, as colonists just reshape the map in this part of the country. But I would recommend talking with those folks as well. We're hoping to do some oral histories down in that area of the state in the very near future. And so we may have more information if you want to check back with us, and definitely check back with Ensley when the archive gets into usable shape then, I guess. Well, I had another question for you. You were talking about the importance of the pottery, and sometimes we have to be careful because we don't want to just say the Catawbas are all pottery, but it is so significant to their survival, but I think as Brooke Bowers pointed out, that the pottery in many ways is tied to the matriarchy.
Yeah.
And so those things are definitely intertwined. But in the 20th century, later 20th century, particularly in 21st century, we see this rise of male potters. We've got Keith Brown joining us, on Wednesday. It just sort of, I don't know if you have a definitive answer, but what do you think happened that brought male potters onto the scene?
Well, I think we are currently in final production of several short documentary films, which will be the first time that we've got documentaries that are Catawba speaking about Catawba. And except for me, everybody involved in the production has been Catawba, and my involvement has just been, please take this money out of this grant. And that's all the direction I've had in it. Excuse me. So yeah, there was traditionally the pottery has been made by the women. I think at some point in kind of culturally, it was just kind of classified as women's work in a way, not in any kind of like how white Americans might have said it, as to kind of denigrate it, but it was, the Catawba, like many Native cultures, the women took care of the home and they took care of the gardens. The men were, warriors and so on. So a lot of everything to deal with that, including the pottery. But pottery has always been, again, a family kind of thing. The men would help dig the clay and beat the clay and prepare the clay. they would also help. The Catawba traditionally don't use glazes, and the way that they do the pottery is by scraping and rubbing and scraping and rubbing and rubbing and rubbing until it becomes like super smooth, and that winds up looking like a glaze once you fire it. And that really was kind of a family thing. So the men were always involved, but I think there was a shift in both Catawba and Catawba American culture, where that moved out of being women's work into being something acceptable for men to do, at least beginning as a kind of a part-time hobby kind of thing, and then that it kind of grew from there. Chief Bill Harris, who is not only an accomplished potter but an accomplished woodworker, and I think honestly will go down as one of the most important leaders of the Catawba, particularly in the modern era. But he as a kid helped his grandmother, who was a potter. Georgia Harris, I believe, was his grandmother, and Martha was his great grandmother. Both really, master potters. And so he would help her do the normal stuff, and that's where he started, as he calls it, playing with clay, and it just caught with him. And so this is something that Catawba men have always been exposed to, and I think it just became somewhere along the way more culturally and socially acceptable, both within the Catawba and within just the surrounding society in general, for men to take part in it and to become kind of the potters. It's kind of an interesting transition, but I think it was just kind of gradual and natural.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned Georgia Harris was a awardee of the National Endowment for the Arts
Right.
Heritage Award, still listed, I think, as being from Georgia. We've been working on that for years to get that.
Right.
She passed away when she was with her son in Georgia, but perhaps Chief Harris can intervene and get that.
Right.
We have a question from Leo Shaver, who's been waiting. Leo, do you want to unmute and ask your question? His hand's up. Let's see. Let me try to ask him to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so you said you worked for the archive?
Yes.
I was wondering, I'm looking for any source material on the Catawba language. I understand that there's kind of a great compilation that's just kind of known as the Catawba Dictionary, and I was wondering where we could find copies of that.
So, and actually, I think Monday you said Becky Garris is coming. Yeah. So Becky Garris is one of the main drivers of the the current Catawba language project. There's an entire group of people who work on this, but Becky is currently, what she's doing right now is going through and basically adding the accent marks and whatnot to the latest versions to that dictionary. So she has the very latest copy of that lexicon, that Catawba dictionary, and she'll be presenting here Monday. She has given me the copy I have in the archives as current as to 2 or 3 months ago, but I mean, she literally, this is an ongoing current process of the language. As I said, they've developed at this point a curricula for elementary and middle schools. They're currently working on the high school curricula and are planning to take it on up. The goal right now, and it's kind of annoying because people speak Catawba, but it's still listed as an extinct language because it's less than 1,000 people who speak it. And I don't know if there is truly a fluent speaker currently alive. There might be. Like I said, Chief Samuel Taylor Blue was the last that we know of, and he died in 61. So this has been kind of a revitalization. And people really are piecing together the language from recordings of Chief Blue and other speakers who predated him, from stuff that people remembered and recorded. It is this amazing ongoing effort. And we really do, certainly within my lifetime, we'll see a full curriculum all the way through the college level of, the Catawba language. But it is, like many tribes, they are really having to go through this long effort. But Becky Garris will be here Monday doing one of these. She is the person to contact, or you can shoot me an email. I'll give Stephen my email to give out to you guys. It's ensley.guffey@catawba.com. You can shoot me an email and we can set up a time, and we can set you up at the archives to look through the dictionary itself. But as I said, that's still being built.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you. I'll email you.
Yeah.
We would be remiss if we didn't mention Professor Claudia Heinemann Priest. Claudia is a colleague of ours at USC Lancaster and works in our center. And Claudia, I think, was the academic linguist who was
right
of the language revitalization movement. And she and Becky have worked closely together for many years. And Claudia is concentrating now on finishing her PhD in comparative literature, but we're hoping in the near future she'll teach a class on the Catawba language. Maybe not teaching the language so much as teaching about the language, but since we started, we wanted to offer Catawba as a second language. We had administrators who would talk about offering Catawba as a foreign language, which of course, the irony there.
Yeah.
But we do have Claudia on our staff, and if you're interested in the more academic, technical, linguistic parts of the language, she would be helpful with that as well. But of course, Becky's an excellent resource as well.
Yeah, and there's an entire team who is working and has been working on the language revitalization project. We just secured 2 more grants to continue that work forward starting this year. So we're that's always one of our priorities, is to make sure we maintain funding for that, because it's just so vital.
Have you looked at I don't know if it still exists, the National Science Foundation had a language preservation grant. Out of curiosity.
Rue George Warren just secured one for us, and I don't know, it wasn't IMLS. I'm not sure what it came from, but I hadn't heard about the science.
It was an endangered language preservation grant, and I contacted them and said, well, what if the last native speaker is gone? But they said, well, when? And I said, well, 1950s, probably. And they said, yeah, if it's less than 50, 75 years, it's still considered a living language because it's still in the living memory,
right,
of people who are still around. So that again, I don't know if that's still available, but at one time it was.
That's worth checking out.
Pretty hefty chunk of money too. It was great for developing a curriculum.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing that's worth mentioning, is that as of now, the entire Catawba Indian Nation is totally grant reliant and grant funded. I'm sure many of you have heard about the casino project and the various suits that the Cherokee have brought against that and all that stuff. But one of the reasons that tribes try to do casinos is because it's one of the few ways that they can make revenue. You can't charge property tax for reservation land, so you can't do that normal municipal raising kind of things. So the casino really is a tremendous opportunity to provide the Catawba financial independence and reduce their reliance on these federal grants. I mean, right now, every year or two, I have to make sure that I am writing and getting grants to cover my paycheck, because that's how I'm funded as the archivist. I have to hunt and kill my own salary, and hopefully, and not just me, but everybody, and hopefully, the casino will help ameliorate that. So.
Well, and Sharon Simmers, who also is working with us at the Native American Studies Center and is a Catawba, who is a descendant of Sam and Sally Blue, mentions here that there are short recordings that she can share. And I'm sure you have some of these, and we have some of the recordings, particularly of, we have a wonderful recording of Chief Sam Blue singing a corn song, and then
nice.
And then a recording of Nola Campbell singing a song that she remembered, but she doesn't know what it means. She just is singing it, just the sounds that she remembers.
Wow.
It's a fascinating comparison, and she explains that when she was growing up, Indian talk was silly, or she was told it was silly, and clearly her parents were wanting her to assimilate into the larger society, but it's heartbreaking about it too, to hear her say that she wishes she had learned that language when she was young, and this is when she was probably a few years from passing away. But
well, and that's a grant I'm really going after this year. Is CLIR does Recordings at Risk because we have a
Yeah.
tremendous amount of magnetic audio tape in one form or another. That, you know, some of it's in materials I just don't have the machines to digitize it, and you know, and it's, I can digitize a cassette tape, but it takes me just as long as it takes the tape to play. So, but this grant would give us the funding to actually have some professionals come in and digitize our collection, no matter what format it's in. And we've got recordings of Chief Blue and Sally Blue, and kind of the same kind of things you were talking about, people who remembered bits and pieces, songs, nursery rhymes, whatever. We even have this microfilm collection that all it is photographs of cards, and I forget who did it, but writing down, spelling, you know, the words.
Yeah.
And that's all that collection is. So I mean, it's an amazing the people who've been working on it have just been doing amazing work to revitalize the language. And you know, it's fun to start hearing it being spoken, and you know, to walk down the halls and everybody's Tanake, you know. So
Yeah, so if anyone knows anyone wealthy who would like to serve as a benefactor for this project, please contact the Catawba Nation.
I'm sure we could name a building after them. It shouldn't be a problem.
All right. Well, I think we're coming up on 3:30. So, any further questions anyone has?
I just have one more. I'm so sorry to be so
no, go right
worried.
ahead.
No, it's fine.
First meeting me, but a lot of, how can I say it? A lot of massacres that occurred for African Americans, you would say, also kind of linked to the native. And in I think something happened in Winsboro, North Carolina. Is that one of those locations? This massacre happened in 1893. Is that one of those 5 parts of, or the 5 counties in North Carolina that are considered with South Carolina?
It's Winslow.
Winsboro.
Well, that's South Carolina. Winsboro, South Carolina.
Yeah.
It's kind of in the border of North Carolina and South Carolina. That massacre occurred in 1893, and I thought maybe because when I was taking notes, I think you said in 1840 they were the Cherokees didn't want them to come in too much, so that happened around the same time in location. So them having to come into a different tribe because their numbers were low.
Well, Winslow is down, or Winsboro rather, is down. Let's see. It's just a little north of Columbia, so it's well in South Carolina. And at the time when they were talking about moving in with the Cherokee, that would definitely have been in the mountains of North Carolina. I'm not familiar with the Winsboro massacre. I would have to do a little research on that, but off the top of my head, I don't know anything about it. But based on its geographic location, I don't think it really has anything to do with that part of Catawba history. I mean, when you're thinking about 1849, there were supposedly 49 adult Catawba left. In 1840, there weren't. You know, there probably were too many more.
Are you meant? Is it Wilkesboro maybe?
I'm not quite sure. I know it occurred in 1893, and it happened in North Carolina, on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina, and a lot of the Indians and things were forced out of their area downward, and some of them came back into South Carolina again.
I'm wondering if this is a Lumbee historical event.
And at this point, I'm self-taught. I'm doing my own digging. There's no real curriculum. I was in South Carolina, a little town, so we don't have a lot of history like this. A lot of this has been on my own, so I'm not quite sure, but I know it's a massacre, 1893 in North Carolina, and a lot of African Americans and Indians were moved from that area, and some of them came back down.
I know that there's the Wilmington massacre in 1898.
Yeah.
Okay, so that might be right.
Well, I'm thinking this is I think this is a Lumbee event.
Yeah, it must be. Yeah.
Becky Garris is saying in the chat that it's Lumbee.
Okay.
So yeah, that might be something. You can contact the folks at UNC Pembroke and their American Indian Studies program. They're very helpful there. I believe they've expanded their museum there as well. So I'm sure they'd be able to give you more information on that. But I think it may be a Lumbee related
Okay.
event. So yeah.
All right. Thank you for answering my question.
All right. So if you have further questions or you think of things later, feel free to email me, Stephen Criswell, CRISWESE at mailbox.sc for South Carolina.edu. But you can find me on the Native American Studies Center website at the USCL site. And then Ensley gave you his email there, and we offered.
I'll put that in the chat.
We'll have that for you. So feel free to email any questions that you have. And as I said, we will be continuing this week on Wednesday. Keith Little Bear Brown will be talking about and demonstrating Catawba pottery. So Ensley talked a bit about the importance of Catawba Indian pottery, and we'll take a look at that on Wednesday. Then on Friday, Faye Greiner will be with us talking about and demonstrating basket making. Faye is also a potter as well. So if you have additional questions about pottery, and then Saturday, Monty Brandon will be joining us performing some music, some flute playing, and hopefully talking a little bit about drum making and flute making. And Monty is also a potter as well as an artist in other areas as well. And then on Monday, the aforementioned all-important Becky Garris will be joining us to talk about basket making, and I'm sure we'll answer questions about all sorts of other things if you have them for her. But again, Ensley, thank you so much for this. It's very informative.
Thanks for asking me.
Well, we're so happy to have you in the area. I know Shelby fairly well. Spent some time there in my youth. I grew up in Gaston County, so
Fair enough.
And we should mention the home of Earl Scruggs, the famous banjo player.
Right.
Among other things. But we appreciate you joining us, and we hope to have you over to the center soon, and look forward to a long partnership with us. And I think that's all we have for today.
All right.
Everybody for joining us, and hopefully we'll see some of you on Wednesday. But thanks a lot. Right. Now I have to kick everyone out.